At 6:47 on a freezing February morning, my phone rang. A stranger's voice told me he had found a young woman barely conscious beneath a bridge, and that the only thing in her pocket was a waterproof note with my number and the word Dad. When I reached her, she clutched my hand and whispered, "They wanted the formula, the cancer treatment. I didn't sign anything, Dad. I didn't give them a single page." Seconds later, she slipped back into unconsciousness. Standing in the bitter cold beside the black water of Ridley Creek, I knew I was not looking at an accident. I was looking at the beginning of a hunt. I am so grateful you are here with me today. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. Here on Revenge, Dad, your presence means everything. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements woven in for reflection and entertainment. Any similarity to actual people or places is coincidental, but everything this story means, I mean completely. The phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had just set my coffee mug on the kitchen counter and glanced at the old clock above the stove, the one Ruth picked out at a yard sale in 1994 and refused to replace even after the minute hand started sticking on the number 8. I had learned to live with a clock that hesitated, seemed fitting somehow for a man like me. The number on the screen was local, a 540 area code somewhere in the Millbrook region, but I did not recognize it. In another life, an unknown number at this hour would have meant one thing: something had gone wrong somewhere, and I was the person they needed. I had spent 30 years answering calls like that. I thought those days were finished. I picked it up. "Is this Walter Hale?" The voice was rough, the kind that belonged to a man who had spent decades outdoors, steady but carrying something underneath the careful tone of someone who had found something he did not want to have found. "My name is Earl Simmons. I do not know you, sir, but I found a young woman down at Ridley Creek Bridge about 20 minutes ago. She was in bad shape. There was a piece of paper in her jacket pocket, waterproof paper, sealed in plastic with this number on it. Just this number and the name Dad." My coffee mug hit the floor. I did not hear it shatter. Every nerve in my body locked onto one word, Dad, and the world outside, that word ceased to exist entirely. "What does she look like?" My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Old training, old habits that never fully leave. Brown hair, early 30s, Earl said. "Green research badge on her jacket. Sir, she is breathing, but not fully conscious. I already called 911. Ambulance should be there in 8 minutes. "Do not let anyone move her," I said, already pulling my jacket from the hook by the door. "And Earl, do not leave her side, not for a second." "Yes, sir," he said. The steadiness in his voice told me he understood the weight of that request. The drive to Ridley Creek Bridge takes 11 minutes on a normal morning. I made it in 7. The February air was knife-sharp when I stepped out of my truck. The ambulance had not arrived yet. Earl Simmons was exactly where he said he would be, a heavy-set man in his late 60s canvas fishing vest and rubber boots, kneeling beside a figure lying at the base of the embankment. My legs carried me down the slope before my mind caught up. Claire. She was on her side, her hair matted against her cheek, one hand stretched out against the frozen grass, as if she had tried to hold on to something, and could not. When I dropped to my knees beside her, my chest seized so hard I thought my ribs might crack from the inside out. "Claire!" My voice broke on her name in a way it had not broken since the night a doctor told me Ruth was gone. "Claire, I am here. Dad is here." Her eyelids fluttered. Breath came from her throat, not words, but breath. She was alive. I pressed my fingers to her wrist and felt her pulse fast and uneven, but present. Every beat felt like a gift I had not earned. That was when I saw her wrists. 2 thin bands of compressed tissue perfectly parallel running across both wrists. Not the torn skin of someone who had grabbed at something to break a fall. Clean. Even. The marks left by soft restraints used deliberately by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. My throat tightened until I could barely pull air through it. Earl cleared his throat. "Before the ambulance gets here, I picked something up." He produced a small Ziploc bag from his fishing vest. Inside it was a single button, small dark 4-hole pattern, with a faint sheen that had no business being near a riverside embankment at sunrise. And I photographed the tire tracks on the shoulder before I came down. Big vehicle, SUV, they pulled off right at the guardrail and drove away. The ambulance arrived, lights washing red and white over the frozen grass. As the paramedics came down, I kept my hand on Claire's shoulder until the last possible moment. I stood at the edge of the riverbank and looked down at the black still water below the bridge. Someone had driven here, opened a door, and left my daughter in the dark. I pulled out my phone. My fingers moved to a number I had not dialed in 12 years. I stared at the screen for exactly 4 seconds. Then I pressed call. Millbrook General Hospital smelled like antiseptic, and the particular silence that only exists in places where people are waiting to find out if someone they love is going to be all right. I had walked these corridors before. 12 years ago, I had stood in a hallway that looked exactly like this one, the same pale green walls, the same humming fluorescent lights, and listened to a cardiologist explain, in careful measured language, that the damage was too extensive and the timeline was very short. That night it ended with me sitting alone on a plastic chair outside a room. I could not bring myself to leave, holding Ruth's hand until there was no longer any point in holding it. Walking through these doors again made my chest ache in a way I had not expected. Grief has a memory of its own, and it does not ask permission before it wakes up. The nurse outside the trauma bay was young, with tired eyes and a clipboard pressed to her chest. "Are you family?" she asked. "I am her father," I said. She stepped aside. Claire was awake. Her eyes found my face the moment I came through the door, and something in them shifted. Some wall that had been holding her together cracked just enough to let the pain underneath show through. Her lower lip trembled violently. Her fingers reached for me. Before I even reached the bed, grasping at the air, and I closed the distance and took both her hands in mine. They were ice cold. "Dad?" Her voice was barely a thread of sound, rough and torn at the edges. "Dad!" "I am here," I said, and my own voice dropped low and unsteady in a way I had not allowed in years. "You are safe, I promise you that." Tears spilled down her face and soaked into the pillow. She did not sob, she was too exhausted for that, but her whole body shook with the effort of holding back what she clearly could not fully hold back anymore. "They wanted the formula," she whispered. Each word cost her something. "The cancer treatment, everything I have worked on for 8 years. Dominic took me to a facility. He said it was a new research site that his family wanted to show me the equipment they were offering to fund." A sound escaped her that was not quite a breath and not quite a cry. "It was not a research site." My jaw locked so hard I felt it in my back teeth. I kept my hands steady around hers because she needed them to be steady. "They had documents ready," she continued. "Transfer agreements, patent assignments. They wanted me to sign everything over the formula, the research data, the clinical trial protocols. My name removed from the discovery entirely." Her eyes filled again, and a sob broke through short and sharp, and she pressed her lips together hard to stop the next one. 8 years, Dad. 8 years of my life." "Did you sign anything?" I asked. "No." The word came out with a force that surprised us both. "I did not sign a single page. I told them they could do whatever they wanted to me. I was not going to hand them something that belongs to patients who need it." I was about to speak when the door opened. The man who stepped through was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that fit the way expensive things fit people who have never thought about the cost. He was carrying white lilies still in the florist's paper. His face wore an expression of practiced concern, the kind I had spent 30 years learning to read. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice warm and well-modulated. "I came as soon as I heard. This has been a terrible accident." "How did you find out she was here?" I asked. He did not miss a beat. "The hospital called the emergency contact on file." I looked at him steadily. "Claire's phone is missing. She was brought in unconscious and unidentified, except for a piece of paper with my number on it. The hospital has no emergency contact on file because she was not formally admitted when you arrived." I kept my voice conversational. "So, I will ask you again, how did you know she was here?" For exactly 1 second, something moved behind Dominic Hargrove's eyes. Then it was gone, sealed over with the smooth surface of a man who had prepared for this. "There must be some miscommunication," he said pleasantly. "These things happen in stressful situations." He set the flowers on the table beside the door, unhurried, entirely at ease. "If there is anything our family can do." "There is nothing," I said. He gave a small, gracious nod and walked out. His footsteps were unhurried, and even on the linoleum floor, the door swung shut. Claire's hand found my wrist and gripped it hard enough to hurt. "He knew exactly when they found me," she said, her voice cracking. "He knew before anyone called him." "I know," I said. I stood and walked to the window. The February sky outside was flat white. My phone was already open, a single message typed and ready. Millbrook General, 2nd floor. Come now. All of you. I sent it, put the phone in my pocket, and turned back to my daughter, who was watching me with eyes that were beginning slowly to understand that the man standing in her hospital room was not entirely who she had always believed him to be. There are things that cannot be faked. Not wounds, not dust, not the particular way a body carries evidence of what has been done to it, written into skin and fabric, and the microscopic residue that transfers from one surface to another, whether anyone intends it to or not. I had spent 30 years reading those things in warehouses and back rooms and hospital corridors far grimmer than this one, and the body of my daughter, lying in a bed on the 2nd floor of Millbrook General, was telling me a story that had nothing to do with an accident. Claire had fallen back into an exhausted sleep 20 minutes after Dominic left. Her grip on my hand had loosened gradually, her breathing deepening, her face finally releasing some of the tension that had held it rigid since I walked through the door. I stayed exactly where I was, in the chair pulled close to the left side of her bed, and I began to read. The marks on her wrists were the first thing, and the most obvious. 2 bands of compressed tissue slightly reddened, running horizontally across both wrists at the same height. Not jagged, not the torn skin of someone who had grabbed at something to break a fall. Even pressure consistently applied. Over a period of time, the signature of soft restraints, the kind used in controlled environments by people who needed a subject immobilized without leaving obvious bruising. I had seen those marks before. I knew exactly what made them. The second thing was the dust on her clothing. Her jacket and the left knee of her pants carried a fine white residue that had the particular texture of quaternary ammonium compound, a heavy-duty disinfectant used in high-containment laboratory environments, biosafety level 2 and above. It was not the kind of cleaning product found in homes or standard office buildings. It was not even the kind used in general hospital wards. It was the kind used in spaces where contamination control was a legal requirement, where every surface was scrubbed on a documented schedule, where the air itself was filtered and recirculated through sealed systems. The third thing was under her fingernails. On her right hand, caught beneath 3 of her nails in small but unmistakable flecks, was paint. Dark blue, a very specific shade, almost navy, with a slight chemical sheen that indicated an epoxy-based coating of the type used on interior walls in industrial research facilities. Not house paint. Not the kind of blue you find in apartments or office buildings. The kind of blue that goes on walls designed to be hosed down. I thought of what Claire had said before she fell asleep. Blue, dark blue, like the old lab walls at Hopkins. She had not been describing a memory. She had been giving me a location. The 4th through 6th things I found. Within the next few minutes, her phone gone, her laptop, bag gone, and the small emergency charger she always kept, clipped to the inside of her jacket pocket, gone as well. Whoever had taken her had been thorough. They had not left her with any device that could transmit a signal or record a conversation, which was why the 7th thing hit me the way it did. I had noticed the waterproof paper in her jacket pocket, the one Earl had found at the bridge, the one with my number on it. But looking at the inside lining of her jacket more carefully now, I found where it had been stored a small seam along the interior left pocket, hand-stitched in thread, that was slightly newer than the surrounding fabric. Claire had sewn that compartment herself, recently. My throat tightened until drawing breath required conscious effort. When Claire was 8 years old, I used to take her on what I called navigation exercises, walks through the neighborhood, where I would give her a starting point and tell her to find her way back to the house using only landmarks and the rules I had taught her. The most important rule, the one I had repeated until she could say it back to me in her sleep, was this: if you ever get lost, leave a mark that only I will recognize. I will always come looking. I will always find it. She had remembered. After 24 years, she had remembered. The 8th thing, the one that made my hands begin to shake for the first time since I had arrived at the bridge that morning, was the absence of her engagement ring. I had not noticed it immediately because I had been focused on her face and her wrists and her breathing, but looking at her left hand now resting against the blanket, I could see the faint indentation on her ring finger, where the ring had sat for nearly 3 years, and I could see that the ring was gone, not lost. The indentation was too clean, too recent for the ring to have come off during a fall. It had been removed deliberately. I pulled out my phone and searched the model number I remembered from the evening Dominic had proposed I had taken a photograph of the receipt Claire left on the kitchen counter, a habit from years of documenting everything, though I had not known at the time why I was doing it. The search returned 3 results. The second one stopped my blood cold. The ring model had been manufactured in a limited run by a company called Sentinel Integrated Solutions, based in Northern Virginia. Their primary client base was not jewelers. It was corporate security firms and private investigation agencies. The ring's band contained a micro-GPS transmitter embedded in the cast metal, invisible to the naked eye, undetectable without specialized equipment, that activated remotely when triggered by a paired device and transmitted location data at intervals of every 4 minutes. Dominic Hargrove had known where Claire was every hour of every day for nearly 3 years. My phone buzzed against my palm. A message from a number stored under the initials RC, dust type confirmed. Quaternary ammonium industrial grade. Virginia has 7 licensed BSL-2 facilities. Hargrove Med Group operates 2. One is their main campus on Route 9. The other is a research annex at Ridley Industrial Park, listed as inactive in public filings, but pulling commercial electricity at full capacity. I am narrowing it down. Give me 90 minutes. Rex Calloway. 48 years old, the best technical analyst I had ever worked with, a man who could pull data from a system that had been wiped 3 times and find something useful in what was left. He had picked up my message and started working before I had even finished sending it. A doctor I did not recognize appeared in the doorway, 50s silver-haired, wearing a Hargrove Med Group lanyard that he had not bothered to tuck under his coat. He smiled at me, with the practiced warmth of someone who had delivered a great deal of difficult news in pleasant tones. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I have been asked by the team at Hargrove Medical Center to assess whether your daughter might benefit from a transfer to our facility. We have a dedicated neurological unit that—" "Oh, and then mean the possibles." "No," I said. The doctor's smile did not waver. "I understand the hesitation, but given the complexity of her presentation, my daughter is not being transferred anywhere," I said, standing up from the chair. I was taller than him by 3 inches, and I made no effort to soften the way I was looking at him. "She is a patient of Millbrook General Hospital, admitted through their emergency department, and she will remain under the care of their staff. If you are not on that staff, you do not have clinical authority in this room." I took 1 step toward the door, which had the effect of placing myself between him and Claire's bed. "I would encourage you to leave." He left. I sat back down beside Claire and put my hand over hers carefully without waking her, and felt her pulse steady and warm beneath my fingers. Outside the window, the February sky was beginning to lighten at its edges, pale gray softening toward white. Somewhere across the city, 4 people I had not spoken to in 12 years were already moving. Frank Dolan did not knock. He never had. In 30 years of working together across 4 continents and more situations than I could count, cleanly Frank Dolan had operated on the assumption that if a door was unlocked, it was an invitation, and if it was locked, he would find another way in. I heard the front door open at 12 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, heard his boots on the hardwood floor of the entryway, and by the time he appeared in the kitchen doorway, I had already pulled a second mug from the cabinet. He looked the same as he always had, broader maybe through the shoulders, and the gray in his hair had finished what it had started a decade ago. But the way he moved was unchanged, measured, deliberate, the walk of a man who always knew exactly where every exit was before he sat down. 55 years old, and built like someone who had never entirely stopped being 28. He stood in the doorway and looked at me for a long moment, and I looked back at him, and then he crossed the kitchen in 4 strides and put both arms around me with a force that drove the air out of my lungs. Frank Dolan was not a man who hugged people. In all the years I had known him, I could count on one hand the number of times he had offered that kind of contact to anyone. He held on for 3 full seconds, long enough that my throat tightened painfully, and my eyes burned in a way I had not expected. And then he stepped back and took the coffee mug I was holding out to him without a word. He sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat across from him, and he looked at me over the rim of his mug with those steady gray eyes that had stared down things most people could not imagine without flinching. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. I laid it out the way I had once laid out operational briefings, clean, sequential, nothing omitted. The call from Earl, the bridge, the hospital, the 8 things I had read on Claire's body, Dominic, the ring. Rex's confirmation about the research annex at Ridley Industrial Park. Frank listened without interrupting. His coffee went untouched. By the time I finished, his jaw was set in a line. I recognized the one that meant he was taking something apart in his mind and putting it back together in a shape he could work with. "The ring," he said. "That is not a standard corporate move. That is personal surveillance. Someone was afraid of her for a long time before they moved against her." "Hargrove has been watching her research for longer than any of us knew," I said. Frank's hand tightened around his mug. His knuckles went briefly white before he released the pressure. "How is she?" "Exhausted, frightened, angry." I paused. "She did not break." Something shifted in Frank's expression. Not quite a smile, but the nearest thing to it that Frank Dolan's face typically produced. "Of course she did not," he said. "She is yours." The laptop on the counter chimed, and I crossed the kitchen to open the video call. Rex Calloway's face filled the left half of the screen, younger looking than his 48 years, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and 3 empty coffee cups visible on the desk behind him. Beside his window, Diane Cho's face filled the right half. Diane was 52, Korean-American born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, and she was the most precise financial analyst I had ever worked with, a woman who could follow a dollar through 17 shell companies across 4 jurisdictions and come out the other side holding a name and a date and a routing number. She was already frowning at something off-screen, which meant she had already found something she did not like. Walter Rex said, by way of greeting. "The annex at Ridley Industrial Park is pulling 3 times the electrical load of an inactive facility. Somebody is running serious equipment in there. I have a footprint consistent with BSL, 2-level ventilation and filtration systems, plus what looks like a backup generator capacity that could run a mid-size hospital wing." He pulled off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "This is not a storage facility. This is an active research and containment site." "Can you get me internal schematics?" I asked. "Already requested through a county permit database. I will have them within the hour." I turned to Diane. "What did you find?" "Enough to make me angry," she said, which from Diane was the equivalent of anyone else slamming their fist on a table. Hargrove Med Group has been routing payments through 7 research entities incorporated in Delaware and Wyoming over the past 15 years. On paper, they are independent contractors. In practice, they share 3 registered agents, 2 of the same board members, and 1 accounting firm in Tyson's Corner that also handles the personal finances of the Hargrove family. She turned her second screen toward the camera columns of figures highlighted in red. In the past 18 months alone, there have been 14 payments totaling $940,000 to individuals listed as security consultants. I ran the names. 4 of them have federal records for extortion, 2 for assault, and 1 for witness tampering. Frank set his coffee mug down on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. "They have done this before," he said. "It was not a question. At least 4 times that I can document," Diane said. 4 researchers in 11 years who lost their positions, their funding, or their reputations within 6 months of declining to transfer work to Hargrove Med Group. One of them. She checked her notes. A Dr. James Whitmore, Johns Hopkins, resigned abruptly in 2019, citing personal reasons. No further academic publications after that date. Prior to 2019, he had published 31 peer-reviewed papers. The other 3 names, Callister Okafor, and a 5th case I am still building. I will walk you through everything tonight. I wanted Whitmore first because of his connection to Claire. The name hit me like something physical. My hand pressed flat against the kitchen counter to steady myself. Claire had talked about James Whitmore the way other people talked about the person who had fundamentally shaped how they understood the world. He had been her doctoral advisor. She had called him the reason she stayed in research when the funding dried up in her 3rd year, and every practical instinct she had told her to find a more reliable path. He had told her that the work mattered more than the difficulty of doing it. He had lost everything because of the same people who had just left my daughter under a bridge in the February cold. "Walter," Diane's voice pulled me back. Her dark eyes were fixed on me through the screen with the particular kind of steadiness she deployed when she needed someone to stay operational. "There is a 5th name. The records show a Dr. Samuel Reeves listed as deceased 2018. Cardiac event according to the county records." She paused. "I cannot find a death certificate. I cannot find a funeral notice. I cannot find a single obituary, a probate filing, or a hospital record of the event." Her voice dropped half a register. "There is no documentation of this man's death anywhere that I can locate. Only the notation in a county database that no one would think to check unless they were already looking." Frank looked at me across the table. His eyes carried the same thought mine did. People do not vanish without a trace because they die. They vanish without a trace because vanishing is the only option left to them. "I know that name," I said slowly. "Reeves. I have seen it before, not in connection with Hargrove. Something else years ago." I straightened up from the counter. "Give me until tonight. I will find out where he is." A knock at the front door, 3 quick, precise raps. Frank was already standing before the second one landed. "That will be Patricia," I said. Dr. Patricia Owens had driven up from her practice in Fredericksburg in under 2 hours, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously she had taken my message. She came through the front door with a briefcase in one hand and her coat still half on her reading glasses hanging from the collar of her blouse, her expression carrying the focused displeasure of someone who had already assessed a situation and found it worse than advertised. "I have been to the hospital," she said before I could speak. "I have reviewed Claire's admission records, conducted my own examination with her consent, and formally documented my findings as an independent forensic medical evaluation." She set her briefcase on the kitchen table and clicked it open. "I have also filed paperwork designating myself as her consulting physician of record, which means that any attempt to transfer her to another facility now requires my written authorization, as well as hers." She looked up at me. "They sent a man with a Hargrove lanyard to her room this morning." "I know," I said. "I sent him away." "He came back 20 minutes after you left," Patricia said. "He did not get past the nursing station." She pulled a manila folder from her briefcase and set it on the table between us. "Walter, the injuries on her wrists and the chemical traces on her clothing are consistent with a period of involuntary restraint in a controlled laboratory environment. I have documented all of it. This is enough for a search warrant application if we can get it in front of the right judge." Frank picked up the folder and opened it, his eyes moving quickly down the first page. Then he passed it across the table to me. I looked at the photographs Patricia had taken, clinical, precise shot under proper lighting. The marks on Claire's wrists looked starker in the photos than they had in the pale light of the hospital room. More undeniable. More like what they actually were. My chest felt as though something inside it was being wrung out slowly with deliberate force. I breathed through it, closed the folder, set it back on the table. "Rex," I said, turning back to the laptop screen. "How long for the schematics?" 40 minutes, Rex said. "Good." I looked around the table at Frank, at Patricia, at Diane's face on the screen beside Rex's. 12 years. 12 years since I had sat in a room with these people and asked them to help me with something that mattered. The specific weight of that, the trust that had survived a decade of silence, pressed against the inside of my ribs in a way that made it hard to speak for just a moment. "Thank you," I said. "All of you." Frank picked up his coffee mug again. "Stop thanking us and tell us what you need," he said. "We have work to do." Rex Calloway could recover audio from a device that had been submerged, shattered, and left in the cold for 6 hours. I knew this because I had watched him do exactly that, once in a situation I was not permitted to document. He had sat at a folding table in a room with no windows and pulled coherent sound out of what looked like a handful of broken plastic and circuit board fragments. And when he played back what he had recovered, it had been enough to close a case that 3 agencies had been working on for 4 years. Claire's smartwatch was in better condition than that. Cracked screen, bent clasp, the kind of damage consistent with being removed forcibly from a wrist. Rex had it connected to his equipment within an hour of Patricia bringing it from the hospital, extracted from the personal effects bag the nursing staff had set aside when Claire was admitted. We were sitting around my kitchen table when he looked up from his laptop and said, "I have something." Frank set down the schematic printouts he had been studying. Patricia looked up from her notes. I put both hands flat on the table. "The watch has a passive audio monitoring function," Rex said, pulling off his reading glasses and setting them beside his keyboard. "It is a security feature built into the model. When the onboard microphone detects sustained sound, above 85 decibels, it begins recording automatically and stores the audio in an encrypted buffer. The idea is to capture evidence if the wearer is in danger." He paused. "Claire never disabled it. Either she did not know it was active or she left it on deliberately." "How long is the recording?" I asked. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He looked at me steadily. Walter, I need to tell you before I play it. What you are about to hear is difficult. Play it, I said. Rex pressed a key. The first sound was a door heavy with the particular resonance of a metal frame sealing against a pressurized threshold, the kind used in containment environments. Then footsteps on a hard floor more than one set, moving at a pace that was unhurried and deliberate. Then Claire's voice. She was not crying. That was the first thing I registered, and the relief of it and the agony of it hit me simultaneously, because what her voice carried instead of tears was something that required far more from a person. A controlled burning steadiness that I recognized because I had heard it in my own voice in rooms where I could not afford to break. I have told you the answer, she said. Her voice was rough at the edges, strained in a way that told me she had been talking for a long time already. The answer is no. It was no this morning, and it is no right now, and it will be no in an hour. You can keep asking. A man's voice answered. Dominic. Smooth, measured with an undertone of irritation that he was working to keep out of his tone and not entirely succeeding. Claire, this is not a negotiation anymore. The documents are prepared. The transfer is structured in a way that protects your contribution. Your name will appear in the acknowledgments. You will receive a research stipend bar. Acknowledgments. Claire's voice cracked on the word, not with grief, but with something sharper, something that had been compressed too long and was finding its way out through the edges of her composure. 8 years! 8 years of my life. My mother's illness pushed me into this field, Dominic. Do you understand that I watched her go through treatment that cost more than my parents earned in 5 years? And I told myself that if I ever had the chance to make something that could help people who did not have that kind of money. Her voice broke fully for just a moment, one sharp intake of breath that she crushed down before it could become something more. I will not give it to you. I will not give it to anyone who is going to lock it behind a price that excludes the people who need it most. My hands pressed so hard against the table that my knuckles ached. Frank was sitting across from me with his forearms braced on the table and his jaw set so tight I could see the muscle working at the corner of it. Patricia had her hand pressed over her mouth. Dominic said something else, lower harder, to make out something with the word consequences in it. Then a door opened again. Different footsteps this time, lighter, more precise. A woman's walk measured and purposeful, the walk of someone who did not hurry because they had never needed to. Then a woman's voice filled my kitchen. It was calm, perfectly, completely calm, the kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the absolute mastery of it, shaped over decades into a tool. The voice of a woman who had stood in front of cameras and philanthropic boards and hospital dedication ceremonies and delivered exactly the right words in exactly the right tone for so long that warmth had become a technique rather than a quality. She has not been uncomfortable enough, Sylvia Hargrove said. Increase the pressure. We are running out of time, and I will not allow a 20-minute delay to become a 24-hour one. The recording ended. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds before Frank shoved his chair back from the table and stood up. The chair scraped against the hardwood with a sound like something tearing. Frank. My voice came out lower than I intended, roughened by something I was fighting to keep contained in my chest. Sit down. Walter. Sit down. I held his gaze across the table until he pulled the chair back and dropped into it, his shoulders rigid, his breathing audible. I understood. Every part of me that was a father, rather than an analyst, wanted to do exactly what Frank's instincts were telling him to do. Get up. Move. Find something to put between that voice and my daughter. But instinct was not what was going to end this. That was Sylvia Hargrove, I said, keeping my voice even. Not Harlan, not Dominic, her. The one who runs the foundation, Patricia said. Her voice was flat and precise. The one who stands next to cancer patients at ribbon-cutting ceremonies and talks about hope. She looked at me. She is the one running this. She was at the facility, I said, which means she was also at the bridge. I looked at Rex. The GPS data from the ring, can you overlay it against traffic camera coverage for the Ridley Creek Bridge access road? Rex was already typing. Give me 20 minutes. I stood up from the table. My legs felt heavier than usual, weighted by something that had no clean physical explanation. The specific gravity of hearing your child's voice refused to break under pressure, and knowing what it had cost her to hold that line. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the street. Millbrook in February, 9 o'clock at night, porch lights on. A neighbor's dog moving through a yellow square of light from a front window. The quiet of a town where people believe the worst things happen somewhere else. Frank appeared beside me. He did not put a hand on my shoulder or offer anything that could be called comfort. He just stood there close enough that I could feel the solidity of him and looked out at the same street. "She did not break," he said quietly. It was the same thing I had said to him earlier in the afternoon. He was giving it back to me now in the way that Frank gave things without ceremony, without softening, just the fact of it laid down like something that would hold weight. "No," I said. "She did not." My phone buzzed on the table behind us. Diane's name on the screen. I crossed the kitchen and picked it up. "Walter," Diane said, and the particular edge in her voice made me go very still. Diane Cho did not alarm easily. She had spent 30 years watching money move through the ugliest channels human beings had constructed, and very little of it had the power to put that note in her voice. "I found something in the Hargrove financial records that you need to hear right now." "Go ahead," I said. 20 years ago, she said, there was a federal investigation into a network distributing counterfeit medical equipment across Virginia and Maryland. The equipment was substandard, in some cases actively dangerous. 6 patients experienced serious complications as a result. A pause. The lead investigator on that case filed a report identifying a primary suspect. The suspect was interviewed twice and released both times due to insufficient physical evidence. The investigation was closed 18 months later when a key witness recanted their statement. My grip on the phone tightened until my fingers went numb. "The suspect's name," Diane said, "was Harlan Hargrove, and the lead investigator who came closest to building a case against him." Another pause, shorter this time, was listed in the case file under the operational designation, Warden. The kitchen felt very quiet around me. "Walter," Diane said. "He knows who you are. He has known since the beginning." Frank Dolan had not slept. I could tell by the way he moved when he came through my front door at 5:40 in the morning, not the loose, slightly unfocused movement of someone running on too little rest, but the coiled, hyper-precise movement of someone who had spent the night making himself ready for something. He had his field jacket on, the dark one he had worn in half a dozen countries under circumstances that could not be discussed in a court of law, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray they went when he had shifted from the part of himself that was a retired man living quietly in Roanoke to the part of himself that had spent 20 years going into places other people needed to leave. "Patricia came through," he said, setting a folder on the kitchen table. "Judge Whitfield signed the warrant at 4:15 this morning." I picked up the folder. Judge Carol Whitfield, Federal District Court, Virginia, 64 years old, 22 years on the bench. A woman who had been offered 3 different federal appointments over the course of her career, and had declined all of them because she believed the work she was doing in Virginia was not finished. Harlan Hargrove had donated $400,000 to a judicial education foundation she was loosely affiliated with 6 years ago. She had recused herself from 2 cases involving Hargrove subsidiaries as a result. She had not recused herself from this. The warrant authorized search and seizure of physical evidence at Ridley Industrial Park Building 7, including biological samples, chemical residues, audio and video recording equipment, any physical trace evidence, and any documentation related to the detention of Claire Hale. Patricia's forensic report had provided the probable cause, the restraint marks, the quaternary ammonium compound. The epoxy paint traces, the sedative compound identified in Claire's blood work that was only licensed for use in BSL-2 facilities. It was a clean, well-constructed application, the kind that did not give a judge room to hesitate. "I am going in with the warrant," Frank said. 2 deputies from the federal marshal's office are meeting me at the site at 6:30. I want to be in and out before Hargrove's legal team has time to file a motion. "Be careful what you touch before the marshals arrive," I said. "Everything goes through proper chain of custody. I do not want anything excluded." Frank gave me the look he reserved for statements he considered beneath the level of the conversation. "Walter, I know how evidence works." "I know you do. I am saying it anyway." He left at 5:55. I sat at the kitchen table with my 3rd cup of coffee and Patricia's forensic notes and waited. The call came at 7:22. "I am inside," Frank said. His voice carried the particular flatness it took on when he was working compressed, functional, every word chosen for precision rather than color. "Building 7, 2nd floor. The main lab space has been cleared out, equipment removed, surfaces wiped. But they move fast and they move sloppy." There are residue patterns consistent with recent heavy equipment removal, and the ventilation filters have not been swapped out. Rex is going to want samples from those. What about the room? I asked. A pause. Longer than Frank's pauses usually were. I found it, he said. I set my coffee mug down. In small room at the end of the second floor corridor. External lock, no internal handle. The walls are painted dark blue, same shade as the paint traces under Claire's nails. There are traces of blood on the floor near the east wall. Small amount, already dried, partially cleaned, but not completely. His voice dropped half a register. And there is something else, Walter. On the north wall. You need to see the photographs. My phone buzzed 3 seconds later. I opened the images Frank had sent. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a single overhead light fixture and no windows. The walls were the dark blue Claire had described, the same heavy epoxy coat used in containment environments. In the corner nearest the door, there were marks on the floor consistent with a chair or cot having been positioned there repeatedly. And on the north wall, at approximately the height of a seated person's reach, there were scratches in the paint. They were small, careful, made with something narrow a fingernail, or the edge of something equally thin. Not the frantic, irregular gouges of someone trying to claw their way out. These were deliberate, placed with intention at measured intervals, forming a pattern that meant nothing to anyone who had not spent an October afternoon 24 years ago, teaching an 8-year-old girl the rules of a navigation game in the backyard of a house in Northern Virginia. 3 short marks, 2 long marks, 3 short again. My throat closed around whatever I had been about to say and would not open back up. When Claire was 8 years old, she had decided that the navigation exercises I took her on were a game, and like every game she played, she had insisted on making it more complicated. She had proposed a system, a simple mark she could leave on tree bark or fence posts, or the corners of buildings that would tell me 2 things: which direction she had gone, and that she was still moving under her own power and had not been stopped. The 3-2-3 pattern meant I was here. I am not lost. Come find me. We had used it exactly twice in the backyard of that house in Northern Virginia before life moved on and the game was put away with other childhood things. I had not thought about it in 20 years. She had remembered. My daughter had been held in that room frightened and exhausted and under pressure that most people could not have withstood, and she had taken whatever she could find to scratch with. And she had left me a message on the wall, not a cry for help, not a record of her suffering, a signal, a deliberate specific signal that said, I know you will come here. I know you will look at these walls. I left this for you. The sound that came out of me was not something I had planned or could have predicted. It was not a word. It was something that had been sitting behind my sternum for the past 18 hours, compressed under everything I had been holding together, and it forced its way out through my throat without asking permission. A short, rough sound that I pressed my fist against my mouth to stop from becoming something larger. I sat at my kitchen table with my fist against my mouth and my eyes burning with a heat I had not felt in 12 years, and I breathed. 1 breath, 2, 3. Frank's voice came through the phone, quiet and steady. She knew you would find it. Yes, I managed. She knew you would come. Yes. The word came out cracked at the edges but holding its shape. I lowered my fist from my mouth, pressed the back of my hand against my eyes for a moment. Then I straightened up in my chair because there was more work to do, and Claire had not held that line for 4 minutes and 17 seconds on a recording, just so I could fall apart at a kitchen table in Millbrook. What else did you find? A button, Frank said. North wall floor level caught in the gap between the baseboard and the floor. Same style and manufacturer as the one Earl Simmons found at the bridge. His voice was careful now, measured in the way it got when he was handing over something significant. Same jacket, Walter. She was wearing the same jacket in that room that she was wearing when they left her at the bridge. This puts her in that specific room before the bridge. Chain of custody documented, photographed, and logged by the federal marshals. A beat. It is enough. My phone buzzed with a second message from Rex Ventilation. Filter samples will confirm the disinfectant compound. I also pulled security footage from the industrial park entrance cameras. Partial plate on a black Escalade entering and exiting Building 7 on 3 separate dates over the past 2 weeks. Running the plate now. I looked at the photographs on my phone again. At the marks on the blue wall. At the scratches my daughter had made with whatever she could find in a locked room with no windows, because she had trusted that I would look at those walls and I would know what I was seeing. Frank, I said. Yeah. Thank you for going in there. A pause. Then, stop thanking people and keep working. Patricia is filing the chain of custody documentation with the court clerk's office at 9. And Walter. His voice shifted just slightly to something a fraction less compressed. She is going to be all right. You understand me? She is going to be all right. I looked out the kitchen window. The February sky over Millbrook was beginning to lighten at the horizon, pale gray edging towards something that was not quite white, the particular color of a winter morning, deciding whether or not to offer any warmth. I picked up my phone and called Diane. I need everything you have on Harlan Hargrove's connection to the Reeves disappearance, I said when she picked up. And I need it before noon. Diane Cho did not deal in speculation. She dealt in numbers, and numbers she had told me once were the only things in the world that could not be coached or pressured or paid to change their story. She arrived at my kitchen door at 9:15 with a leather portfolio under one arm and the expression of someone who had been awake for 30 hours and was running on professional discipline and black coffee. Frank was still at the industrial park with the marshals. Patricia was at the hospital with Claire. It was just the two of us, and Diane sat down, opened her portfolio, and began. 4 researchers, she said. 11 years. All of them declined to transfer intellectual property to Hargrove Med Group. All of them experienced significant professional or personal disruptions within 6 months of that refusal. She turned the first page toward me. Dr. Ann Callister, University of Virginia, 2013. Lost her federal research grant after an anonymous ethics complaint. The complaint was later found to be unsubstantiated, but the investigation took 14 months, and her lab was shut down during that period. She never reopened it. I looked at the document. Callister had been researching early detection biomarkers for pancreatic cancer. Dr. Raymond Okafor, Virginia Tech, 2016. Diane continued turning the next page. His research partner filed a lawsuit alleging misappropriation of shared data. The lawsuit was funded through a legal services company incorporated in Delaware that shares a registered agent with 2 of Hargrove's shell entities. She tapped the page. The suit was dropped 18 months later. By that point, Okafor had accepted a position in a private laboratory in Singapore. He has not published in the United States since. And Whitmore, I said. Diane paused. She looked at me the way she looked at things that required precision. Dr. James Whitmore, Johns Hopkins, 2019. No lawsuit, no ethics complaint. He simply resigned in April of that year and issued a statement citing personal reasons. No further academic affiliation, no publications, no conference appearances. She closed the portfolio briefly, then opened it again, her jaw set. He was Claire's doctoral advisor for 4 years. I pulled his publication record. 31 peer-reviewed papers before April 2019. She met my eyes. 0 after. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. I did not notice until I picked it up and felt the temperature of it against my palm. I set it back down without drinking. Claire had called Whitmore the reason she stayed in research when every practical instinct told her to leave. He had told her the work mattered more than the difficulty of doing it. He had shaped the way she understood what science was supposed to be for. Hargrove had taken that from her without her ever knowing it had happened. Walter. Diane's voice was careful. There is something else. She turned to the last page. A photograph, a man in his mid-50s taken at what appeared to be a university conference, smiling at someone off camera. Below it, a name Dr. Samuel Reeves, and below that, a single line, deceased March 2018. I have spent 14 hours looking for documentation of that death, Diane said. No death certificate filed in Virginia, Maryland, or any adjacent state. No hospital admission record. No funeral home record. No probate filing. No obituary. No Social Security death notification. She turned the photo to face me directly. Samuel Reeves does not exist in any public record after February of 2018. But he also does not exist as a dead man. He simply stops. People do not stop, I said. They either die or they disappear. Correct. Diane closed the portfolio and looked at me steadily. And people who disappear by choice usually have a reason. In Reeves's case, I believe the reason is that he had documentation Hargrove needed destroyed, and he understood that the only way to keep it intact was to remove himself from reach entirely. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the February sky had flattened to a uniform gray that pressed down over the rooftops of Millbrook like a lid. Reeves had walked away from his career, his name, his entire life, and he had taken something with him, something worth protecting for 11 years in the hope that someone would eventually come looking. "I have a contact," I said, "someone who might know where he went. Give me until tonight." Diane nodded, gathered her portfolio, and stood. At the kitchen doorway she stopped. "Walter, Whitmore Okafor Callister Reeves, and now Claire." Her voice did not waver, but something moved through it that I recognized as the professional equivalent of fury. "This is not opportunism. This is a system. They built a system for doing this, and they have been running it for over a decade." The words settled into the room like something heavy being set down. "I know," I said, "and we are going to take it apart piece by piece." Earl Simmons lived on Carpenter Street in a house that looked exactly like what it was, the home of a man who had spent 40 years taking care of other people's children and had never quite gotten around to taking care of his own front porch. The paint was peeling at the eaves. A wind chime made from old fishing lures hung beside the door. The welcome mat said, "Come back with a warrant," which I suspected was meant as a joke and turned out under the circumstances to feel more pointed than funny. He answered the door before I knocked, which told me he had been watching the street. "Figured you would come back," Earl said, pushing the door open wider. His voice was steady, but his eyes moved past me to the street behind me before they came back to my face. The eyes of a man who had started paying attention to things he had not paid attention to before. We sat in his kitchen. The table was covered in fishing magazines and a half-finished jigsaw puzzle of a Montana River valley. Earl poured coffee without asking and set the mug in front of me with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing a bus full of children and understood that people functioned better when their hands had something to hold. "The morning I found your daughter," he said, settling into the chair across from me, "I saw something I did not mention to the police." I set my mug down. "There was a vehicle on the Bridge Approach Road when I arrived." His hands wrapped around his own mug, squeezing slightly. "Black SUV high-end parked with the engine running. A woman got out. She walked to the guardrail, looked down to where your daughter was lying, and stood there for about a minute." His jaw tightened. "She did not call out, did not go down to help, just looked. Then she got back in the vehicle and drove away." I pulled out my phone and found a photograph Sylvia Hargrove at a hospital ribbon-cutting ceremony 18 months ago. White blazer practice smile, her hand on the shoulder of a child in a wheelchair. I turned the screen toward Earl. He looked at it for 2 seconds. "That is her," he said, and his voice carried the flat, unambiguous certainty of a man who had no reason to lie and knew exactly what he had seen. "Same coat, same way of standing like the ground belongs to her." My chest tightened with a cold, focused fury that had nothing to do with heat. I was writing down Earl's statement in the small notebook I had carried in my jacket pocket for 30 years, when the back door banged open and a teenager came through it with the particular energy of someone who had been running and was trying not to show it. Danny Simmons was 16 with Earl's square jaw and considerably less of Earl's composure. He was breathing fast, and his eyes went immediately to his grandfather rather than to the stranger at the table. "There was a man at school today," Danny said. "He came to the front office, said he was from a community outreach program, asked Mr. Peterson if our family had been involved in any incidents near Ridley Creek recently. He pulled out his phone and showed Earl the number the man had left. Mr. Peterson thought it was weird and told me about it." Earl looked at the number, then he looked at me. "They are already moving," I said. Earl's face did something complicated, the face of a man absorbing the information that the trouble he had walked into was larger than he had understood when he made the choice to pick up a waterproof piece of paper and dial the number written on it. But his jaw set, and he did not reach for the door. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Your statement in writing witnessed and dated," I said. "And I need you and Danny to spend the next few days somewhere that is not this house." Earl looked at his grandson. Danny looked back at him with the specific expression of a teenager who understood that the right answer was to keep his mouth shut and let the adults work. Earl turned back to me. "I picked that button up because it seemed wrong to leave evidence lying in the grass," Earl said. "A girl was hurt. That is all I knew. I would do it again." He stood and extended his hand across the table. "You tell me where to go, and we will go." I shook his hand. His grip was the grip of someone who meant what he said. Outside, I called Frank. "Simmons and his grandson," I said. "Tonight. The address I'm sending you now." "Done," Frank said. I stood on Earl's porch for a moment, looking at the fishing lure wind chime turning slowly in the February cold. My phone buzzed a message from a number I did not recognize. "You are in over your head, old man. Last warning." I photographed the message, forwarded it to Rex for metadata analysis, and put my phone back in my pocket. Then I got in my truck and drove toward whatever came next. Some cases never close. They sit in the back of your mind the way a splinter sits under skin, not always painful, but always present, always detectable when you press on the right spot. In 30 years of work, I had closed most of what I had opened. Most, not all. Harlan Hargrove had been the one I could not close. I found the file at 11:40 at night in the locked drawer of the desk, in my back room, the room Claire had always called the study, the room Ruth had called the room Walter goes to. When he needs to think the room I had not opened in nearly 8 months because there was no longer anything in my life that required what was inside it, until now. The file was thinner than I remembered. 20 years reduces things. The urgency bleeds out of documents, the names become historical rather than immediate. The photographs of people look like photographs of someone else's problem. I spread the contents across the desk under the lamp and read through them slowly, and the details came back not like memories, but like something I had never entirely stopped knowing. The investigation had begun in the spring of 2005. A network of counterfeit medical equipment moving through distribution channels across Virginia and Maryland, blood pressure monitors that read 15 points low, IV flow regulators that delivered incorrect dosages, surgical instruments with metal compositions that degraded under sterilization, the kind of equipment that did not kill people immediately, the kind that created complications weeks or months later in ways that were difficult to trace back to a single point of failure. 6 patients had experienced serious complications. 2 of them were children. I had spent 14 months building the case. I had identified Harlan Hargrove as the primary source, a man who had used his medical supply subsidiary to move the counterfeit equipment through 3 layers of legitimate distributors, collecting margins at each step, while keeping his own name far enough from the transaction chain to maintain plausible deniability. I had come close. I had been close enough that I could see exactly how it fit together, could see the shape of the thing, as clearly as I could see my own hands. And then a key witness had recanted. His name had been Thomas Brierly, a warehouse manager who had signed a detailed statement describing inventory procedures that directly implicated Hargrove's subsidiary. 12 days before the case was scheduled to go to a federal grand jury, Brierly had retracted every word of it. His attorney had filed the retraction on a Friday afternoon, which was the kind of timing that told you everything you needed to know about who had planned it. The case had been closed 6 months later due to insufficient evidence. I had never found out what they had used on Brierly, money most likely, or something more personal, the kind of pressure that did not leave marks. Either way, by the time I had started pulling at that thread, I had been reassigned to something else, and the file had gone into a drawer, and Harlan Hargrove had walked away free, and had apparently spent the next 20 years expanding his operation and making sure it was better insulated than it had been before. And he had spent those 20 years knowing my name. That was what sat in my chest like a stone as I read through the file in the lamplight of my back room. Not the failure of the original case I had made peace with, that or something close enough to peace that it functioned the same way. What sat in my chest was the understanding that Harlan Hargrove had known who I was when Dominic began pursuing Claire. He had known who her father was. He had factored that into whatever calculation he had made before he moved against her, which meant one of 2 things. Either he had decided that the man I had been 20 years ago was no longer a threat to him, that 12 years of a quiet life in Millbrook had made me soft enough and disconnected enough that I could be handled, that my daughter could be used as leverage, or simply as a target without meaningful consequence. Or he had decided that the satisfaction of taking something from me specifically was worth whatever additional risk it introduced. I was not sure which possibility made me colder. I picked up my phone and called Diane. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had not been sleeping either. "The Brierly retraction," I said. 2005, I need to know where Thomas Brierly is now, and I need to know if there is any financial connection between him and any Hargrove entity in the past 6 months. A pause. Keyboard sounds. "Give me an hour. Diane, I looked at the photograph of Harlan Hargrove from the original case file, younger, sharper at the edges, the same fundamental quality of absolute confidence in his own untouchability, visible even in a grainy surveillance photograph taken outside a courthouse in 2005. He knew. When he sent Dominic after Claire, he knew she was mine. "I know," Diane said. Her voice carried something that was not quite anger, something older and more controlled than anger. Which means this was never only about the formula. I looked at the photograph for another moment. Then I closed the file, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark of my back room with my hands flat on the desk. Ruth had a saying about men like Harlan Hargrove. She had said it once quietly on an evening when I had come home from work carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that came from spending a day inside someone else's capacity for cruelty. She had set a cup of tea on the table in front of me and sat down across from me and said, "The ones who think they are untouchable always make the same mistake. They start to believe their own story." I had thought about that sentence many times over 20 years. I thought about it now in the dark with Harlan Hargrove's 20-year-old photograph face down on the desk in front of me. He had believed his own story. He had believed it long enough and completely enough that he had reached for my daughter. That was his mistake. And unlike Thomas Brierley's retraction, unlike the 6 patients whose complications could not be traced, unlike the case that had gone into a drawer and stayed there, this one was not going to be closed without consequence. I turned the desk lamp back on, pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer, and wrote 2 words at the top of the first page. Reeves, tomorrow. Before I revealed the name of the person who had been secretly working against Claire from the very beginning, someone she trusted completely, someone who sat beside her every single day in that laboratory comment, the number 10 right now. So, I know you are still here with me, because what comes next changed everything. A gentle note: this story weaves in some fictional elements for depth and reflection. If that is not what you came for, no hard feelings at all. You are always free to step away. Marcus Webb lived in a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Clement Street that smelled like old carpet and someone's dinner from 2 floors below. I found his name through Diane, who had pulled Claire's laboratory personnel files from the University Research Office database in under 4 hours. Marcus had been Claire's primary research assistant for 3 years, the person who knew her work almost as well as she did, who had been in the lab on the days Claire stayed home sick, who had countersigned her equipment requisitions, and helped her prepare her grant renewal applications. I knocked at 7:15. He opened the door on the second knock. Marcus Webb was 29 years old, and he looked younger than that and older than that simultaneously. The face of someone who had not been sleeping stretched over the bones of someone who had not been eating enough, with eyes that went to my face and stayed there with the particular expression of a man who had been waiting for a consequence to arrive and had finally heard it knock. He did not ask who I was. He stepped back from the door and let me in. The apartment was small and clean, in the way that small spaces get clean when someone has been pacing them for days. Everything pushed to the edges, the center of the room cleared as if space itself might help with breathing. A photograph on the small table beside the window. Marcus and a woman in her 50s, both of them squinting into summer sunlight, her arm around his shoulders. She was thinner than she should have been. Her smile was the smile of someone working to produce it. I sat in the only chair. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed and pressed his palms together between his knees and looked at the floor. "I know why you are here," he said. His voice was rough at the edges, scraped raw. "I have been trying to figure out how to find you for 2 days. I did not know how." "Tell me," I said. He told me. It had begun 14 months ago, when his mother Helen's oncologist had recommended a 2nd round of chemotherapy following a recurrence. The treatment was not covered under her insurance plan at the level required. The gap between what the insurance would pay and what the treatment actually cost was $63,000 spread across 8 months. Marcus had no savings that could cover it. He had applied for 3 medical hardship programs and been declined by 2, waitlisted for the 3rd. A man had approached him outside the research building on a Tuesday afternoon in December, polished, friendly, with a business card from a healthcare consulting firm that Marcus had not thought to verify. He had said his firm was conducting authorized market research on emerging cancer treatments and offered Marcus a monthly retainer for progress reports on the research he was assisting with. Nothing proprietary, the man had said. General timelines, milestone, updates, the kind of information that appeared in grant applications anyway. Marcus's voice cracked on the next part. I told myself it was not really betrayal. He said, his hands pressing together so hard his knuckles went white. I told myself Claire would understand if she knew why. I told myself the information was not that sensitive. He looked up at me for the first time since he had started speaking, and his eyes were wet and furious, not at me, but at himself, the specific fury of someone who had watched themselves do something they could not take back and had been living inside that knowledge ever since. And then I saw the news, about Claire, about what they... His voice broke fully, a short, hard sound that he pressed his lips together to contain. I put my mother's life over Claire's safety. I did not mean to, but I did. The room held that for a moment. I looked at Marcus Webb, at the photograph of him and his mother in the summer sunlight, at his white knuckles, at the way his shoulders were curved inward as if he were trying to make himself smaller than the thing he had done. And I felt something that was not forgiveness and was not condemnation, but was something in the complicated space between them, the space where most human beings actually lived. There is something else, I said. The data you sent them. He looked up sharply. It does not work, I said. Whatever formula they have, it is missing something. I need to know what you changed and why. Marcus stared at me. Then something in his face shifted, something that had been braced against impact slowly releasing just slightly, as if he had been holding a door shut for a long time, and someone had finally come to stand on the other side of it with him. 4 months ago, he said, I realized what they were going to do with it, not market research. They wanted the whole formula, and they were going to use it to charge prices that would exclude every patient who needed it most. He reached under the bed and pulled out a manila envelope, and his hands were shaking badly enough that he had to set it on the mattress before he could open it. Inside were printed copies of every report he had sent, each one annotated in red pen. I changed the binding coefficient in the final synthesis stage. The formula they have produces a compound that is structurally incomplete. It will fail in phase 2, testing every time. I took the envelope, looked through the first 3 pages. The annotations were precise, detailed the work of someone who understood exactly what he had done and had documented it with the care of a person preparing to be held accountable. I need you to talk to someone, I said. A federal agent. You will tell her everything you told me, and you will give her this envelope, and you will agree to cooperate fully with the investigation. Marcus's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the photograph of his mother. What happens to me? I cannot promise you anything, I said, which was the truest and most honest answer I had. What I can tell you is that you have 2 things working in your favor. You altered the data to protect the research, and you are coming forward voluntarily. I leaned forward slightly. Marcus, what you did was wrong. What you did after it was something else. He looked at the envelope in my hands for a long moment. His throat moved. My mother, he said, if I cooperate, she loses the treatment funding. The retainer payments stop. I pulled out my phone and called Dr. Patricia Owens. When she picked up, I said, I need Claire's clinical trial access protocol for the new compound, specifically the compassionate use pathway for patients who meet the profile. I looked at Marcus while I said it. I have a candidate. Patricia's voice was careful. That would need Claire's authorization. I know. I will get it tonight. I ended the call and looked at Marcus. Your mother's name and her oncologist's contact information. Write it down. His hand was shaking so badly that the pen skipped twice on the paper before he got the letters out. He tore the page from the notepad and held it out to me. And when I took it, his fingers did not immediately release it, just held on for 1 extra second the way people hold on to the last thing they have to give when they are not sure. Giving it is enough. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank me by telling the truth to Agent Torres. I said standing. All of it. Everything. I drove directly from Clement Street to the federal building on Courthouse Road, where Agent Rebecca Torres was waiting with a pot of bad coffee and a recording device, and the particular focused patience of a woman who had spent 15 years working cases that required her to wait for the right moment and recognize it when it came. Marcus Webb walked in behind me and sat down across from her and began to talk. The man who had been Samuel Reeves for 58 years and Alan Cross for the past 11 of them appeared on my laptop screen at 9:40 in the morning, sitting at a kitchen table in front of a window that framed a wide stretch of Montana grassland, going brown at the edges in the February cold. He looked like a man who had learned to live carefully. His hair was gray and cut close. his face weathered in the way that comes from spending time outdoors rather than under laboratory lighting, and he was wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed enough times to go soft. The only thing on the table in front of him was a mug and a manila folder, thick enough that it had to be held closed with a rubber band. He looked at me through the screen for a long moment without speaking. His jaw worked slightly the way a jaw works when someone is making a decision they have already made and is simply feeling the weight of it one final time. "They told me your name," he said. His voice was quiet and measured with the particular steadiness of a man who had spent 11 years making sure he did not react to anything too quickly. "The person who contacted me. They said Walter Hale. I asked them to repeat it." "I appreciate you agreeing to speak with me," I said. "Agreeing." He let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh. "I have been waiting for someone to call for 11 years, Mr. Hale. Agreeing is not quite the right word." He had been a researcher at the University of Maryland in 2013, pancreatic cancer early intervention protocols, the kind of work that attracted grant money and conference invitations, and the attention of people who understood what it might be worth if it reached clinical application. Hargrove Med Group had approached him through an intermediary that spring. The offer had been structured carefully. A partnership, they called it, a collaboration between academic research and private infrastructure, the kind of arrangement that got treatments from laboratory to patient in a fraction of the usual time. Reeves had been interested. He had taken 3 meetings. In the 4th meeting, the language had changed. They did not want a partnership. Reeves said, his hands flat on the table in front of him, very still. They wanted an acquisition, full transfer of the research, the data, the protocols, all patent rights in exchange for a payment that was less than 1% of what the treatment would generate in its first year on the market. His voice tightened slightly. When I declined, the intermediary smiled and said he hoped I would reconsider because things could become complicated for researchers who did not understand the value of cooperation. What had followed was systematic and precise. An anonymous complaint to his university's research ethics board, unfounded, but requiring 14 months to investigate and resolve, during which time his lab had been suspended. A lawsuit from a former graduate student alleging data misappropriation funded through a legal entity that Reeves had eventually traced to a Delaware shell company. The withdrawal of 2 federal grants following communications from an unnamed source to the relevant agency offices. "By 2018, I had nothing left," Reeves said. "No position, no funding, no professional standing. And I had started to understand that the next step would not be professional." He looked directly at the camera. "There was a car accident in February of that year. I walked away from it. The car did not." A pause. "I chose to let certain people believe I had not walked away either." "The documentation," I said. "You kept it." He put his hand on the manila folder. "Everything," he said. "The original meeting notes, the communications, the incorporation records I traced for the shell companies, the grant agency correspondence." His fingers pressed down on the folder. "And the clinical trial data." His voice shifted, dropping to something quieter and harder. "Mr. Hale Hargrove Med Group submitted falsified efficacy data to the FDA in 2015 for a pain management compound. The actual trial results showed a 14% rate of serious adverse events in the patient population. The data they submitted showed 1.8%. He looked at me steadily. Patients were prescribed that compound. Some of them experienced complications that were attributed to their underlying conditions. The connection was never investigated because no one knew to look for it. The numbers settled into the room with the weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be put down somewhere. "How many patients?" I asked. "In the trial, 41. In post-market distribution before the compound was quietly discontinued." He opened the folder and looked at the top page. "My best estimate based on prescription data and adverse event reports I was able to access before I disappeared is between 200 and 300 individuals over a 4-year period." My hand pressed flat against the desk. "I will testify," Reeves said before I could speak. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed alone in empty rooms for years, not dramatically, but with the flatness of absolute certainty. "I will testify to everything. I have waited 11 years to say that to someone who had the standing to act on it, and I would like to not wait any longer." "There will be protection," I said. "Federal witness protection if necessary. Agent Torres at the FBI field office in Alexandria will handle your case directly. She has the standing and the evidence base to move on this at the federal level. Reeves nodded. His jaw was set and his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears. The brightness of someone who had been carrying something alone for so long that the prospect of setting it down had become almost more than they could hold steady for. "Mr. Hale," he said. "The young woman, the researcher, Claire." He had been briefed on the basics by the intermediary. "Is she going to be all right?" "Yes," I said, and the word came out with more force than I intended, the force of a promise rather than a prediction. "She is." Something in Reeves's face softened at the edges. "Good," he said quietly. "Because what she built, what they tried to take from her, it matters. It matters more than any of them understand." He looked down at the folder under his hands. "That is worth protecting." I called Frank when the video call ended. "Montana," I said. "I am sending you the address. He has documentation that will add 200 counts to what we are already building. Bring him back carefully." Frank did not ask questions. He was already moving by the time I ended the call. I sat at my desk and looked at the legal pad in front of me, the one with Reeves. Tomorrow written at the top, which was now today, which meant tomorrow was something else. I picked up the pen and wrote the next line. "Torres, tonight, everything we have." Sylvia Hargrove always wore white in front of cameras. I had noticed it in the photographs Diane had pulled, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, charity galas, hospital dedications. Always white, the color of cleanliness, of medicine, of people who had nothing to hide. She understood what images communicated to an audience before a single word was spoken, and she had been curating her image for long enough that the curation had become invisible, which was the point. The press conference aired at 2 in the afternoon on Channel 7. I watched it on the television in my kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee I had forgotten to drink, and I watched Sylvia Hargrove stand at a podium in a white blazer and look into the cameras with an expression of measured, dignified sorrow. And I listened to her describe my daughter as a troubled young woman whose recent behavior had caused the Hargrove family significant pain and confusion. Nora Hargrove stood at the podium first. She was precise and smooth, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent years in courtrooms and knew exactly how to make a statement sound like established fact rather than allegation. She described Claire's history of what she called emotional instability. She used the phrase self-inflicted injury twice. She said the Hargrove family had attempted to support Claire through what they characterized as a difficult period in her personal life, and that Dominic in particular had extended himself considerably on her behalf, and that the family was saddened but not surprised that Claire had chosen to respond to that support with unfounded accusations. Then Sylvia stepped forward. "We have only ever wanted what is best for Claire," she said, her voice warm and unhurried. Her eyes were slightly reddened at the rims, just enough to suggest recent tears without making her seem undignified. "We hope she gets the help she needs, and we hope she finds peace." I turned off the television. I stood in the kitchen of my house on Dunmore Street, and I looked at the blank screen, and I breathed through something that moved through my chest like a slow fire. Not the hot, reactive anger of the first hours after the bridge, but something colder and more deliberate, the kind of feeling that does not want to explode, but to press steadily and without stopping until whatever is in its way gives. My phone rang. "Claire." I picked up before the second ring. "Dad." Her voice was tight and controlled in a way that told me she was working very hard to keep it that way. "I just watched it. They said I did this to myself. They said I am unstable. They said Dominic was trying to help me." A pause, and in the pause I could hear her jaw tightening, could hear the effort of a woman who had refused to break in a locked room for 4 minutes and 17 seconds and was refusing to break now. "Dad, they are going to put that on every newsfeed in Virginia. Everyone I have worked with for 8 years is going to see that, and—" "Claire," I said, "why are you not saying anything? Why are you not putting out a statement? Call someone, call Agent Torres, call Claire." I kept my voice even and low. "I need you to listen to me. Can you do that?" A sharp breath on the other end of the line. Then, "Yes." "Everything they said today is going on record," I said. "Every false statement Nora made, every implication Sylvia performed for those cameras, all of it is documented, time-stamped, and being preserved as evidence of deliberate defamation and obstruction. If I put out a statement right now, they know we are ready to move. If I stay quiet, they believe they have frightened us into retreat." I paused. "I need them to believe that for 2 more days." The silence on Claire's end lasted long enough that I felt the weight of it. 2 days, she said finally. Her voice had changed, not softer, but differently steady, the steadiness of someone who has decided to trust something they cannot fully see yet. 2 days, I said. And then every word they said today becomes a charge on the indictment. Another pause. Then, okay, Dad. And then quieter, okay. I ended the call and stood at the window. 20 minutes later, Detective Ray Morrow called my cell phone. I recognized the number from the police department directory Rex had pulled. Mr. Hale, he said, with the careful friendliness of a man performing normality. I wanted to give you an update on your daughter's case. After a thorough review of the available evidence, we have concluded that the incident at Ridley Creek Bridge was consistent with an accidental fall. There is no indication of criminal activity, and the case has been closed. I see, I said. I understand this may be difficult to hear, Morrow continued, but I want to assure you that we conducted a thorough, Detective Morrow, I said. The physical evidence sample collected from my daughter's clothing, the quaternary ammonium compound residue. Where is it currently? A half-second pause, barely perceptible, but I had spent 30 years listening for half-second pauses. I would need to check the evidence log, he said. Please do, I said pleasantly. I will hold. He did not put me on hold. He ended the call. I set my phone on the counter and called Diane. Morrow just confirmed the sample is gone, I said. Pull his financials, everything in the past 6 months. Already started, Diane said. Walter, I have a preliminary number. $40,000 deposited across 4 transactions into a personal account at a credit union in Harrisonburg. The source is a payroll account registered to a landscaping company in Waynesboro that shares an address with one of the Hargrove shell entities. My jaw tightened until I felt it in the back of my skull. Send everything to Torres tonight, I said. Morrow goes on the arrest list. I ended the call, looked at the blank television screen across the room. Sylvia Hargrove's face had been on that screen 20 minutes ago, composed sorrowful white blazer and reddened eyes describing my daughter's suffering as a personal failing and a family inconvenience. Every camera in that room had captured it. Every word had been recorded. I thought of what Ruth had said about men like Harlan Hargrove, about people who believed their own story. Sylvia had believed her story too. She had believed it in front of cameras and foundations and hospital boards for so long that she had stopped being able to tell the difference between the performance and the reality. In 2 days, the cameras were going to tell a different story. I picked up my phone and sent Torres a single message tomorrow night. My house. Bring everything. The message came in at 8:47 in the evening from a number I did not recognize but recognized immediately. Dominic Hargrove had always been careful with his words in person measured smooth, every sentence constructed to land exactly where he intended it. The message he sent me that night was not careful. It was the message of a man who had watched his family's press conference and understood somewhere beneath the performance of confidence that the ground was shifting and that he needed to move before it shifted further. I can give you everything. Financial records going back 15 years. Communications between my father and his outside contractors, offshore account numbers in the Cayman Islands and the Isle of Man, documentation of every transaction related to the 4 researchers before Claire, all of it. In exchange, I want full immunity from prosecution and 30% ownership of the patent rights to Claire's research. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the kitchen table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. 30%. He had tried to steal the entire thing and been stopped, and his response was to offer to betray his family for 30% of what he had failed to take. There was something almost clarifying about it, the absolute consistency of a man who had never at any point in this story been motivated by anything other than what he calculated he could acquire. Agent Rebecca Torres arrived at my door at 9:15. She was 44 years old, with close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years in rooms where saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment could end an investigation they had spent years building. She had worked under me for 3 years, in a unit that did not officially exist back when she was 29, and I was watching her become the kind of investigator that only appeared once or twice in a generation. When I had gone quiet 12 years ago, she had moved to the FBI field office in Alexandria and built a career that I had followed at a distance with something close to pride. She sat down at my kitchen table, looked at the phone I pushed toward her, and read Dominic's message without expression. Then she set the phone down and looked at me. "Immunity is not mine to give," she said. "That is the U.S. Attorney's Office, and based on what you have brought me in the past 4 days, they are not going to be in a generous mood." She pushed the phone back across the table. "But this message is useful." "Intent," I said. "Intent," she confirmed. "He is documenting his own willingness to commit wire fraud in real time. The offer to exchange evidence for patent rights constitutes attempted extortion of an ongoing federal investigation." She opened the folder she had brought and spread 3 documents across the table. "Walter, I need to talk to you about where we are, because where we are is further along than I expected to be at this point, and I want to make sure we close this correctly." She laid it out methodically the way she had always worked, building from the foundation up, making sure each layer was solid before she added the next one. The forensic evidence from the research annex documented and in chain of custody. The audio from Claire's smartwatch authenticated by Rex and admissible under Virginia's electronic surveillance statutes. Earl Simmons' written statement identifying Sylvia at the bridge. The financial documentation Diane had compiled, shell companies, contractor payments, Morrow's $40,000. Marcus Webb's cooperation agreement, signed that morning, including the annotated reports and his testimony about the altered binding coefficient. Dr. Reeves, in transit from Montana with 11 years of documentation. "The arrest warrants are ready," Torres said. "Judge Whitfield has reviewed the probable cause affidavit. She will sign on my authorization." She looked up from the documents. "What I need from you is a location, somewhere they will come willingly where we can control access and capture the conversation we need to close the conspiracy charges." "They are going to contact Claire," I said. "Within the next 24 hours. They need her signature on the transfer documents. The press conference was pressure, not resolution. They will arrange a meeting." Torres nodded slowly. "And you want it to be at their location." "At their conference center," I said. "Hargrove Med Group main campus, their ground." She studied me. "That is a significant operational risk. It is also the only place Harlan Hargrove will feel secure enough to say the things we need him to say." I leaned forward slightly. "He has spent 20 years believing that his own walls protect him, that his security team is loyal, that his building is sealed, that he controls every variable inside it." I paused. "He is wrong about the security team. He does not know that yet. By the time he finds out, it will be recorded." Torres was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February wind moved through the bare trees on Dunmore Street with a sound like paper being turned. "How long do you need to position your people?" she asked. 36 hours, I said. "I will give you 30, she said. "After that, I cannot hold the warrants without beginning to compromise the investigation's integrity." She began gathering the documents back into her folder, each one aligned precisely before she set it on the stack. "Walter, I need to say something." "Say it." 15 years ago, when you went quiet, I spent about 6 months being angry about it," she said, without looking up from the documents. "Then I spent about 6 more months understanding why. Then I stopped thinking about it because I had work to do." She closed the folder and looked at me directly. "I am glad you called." "So am I," I said. She stood, picked up her folder, and moved toward the door with the same purposeful efficiency she had always had, the walk of someone who had a list and was already mentally moving to the next item on it. At the door, she stopped. 30%, she said, with the flat, almost amused tone that passed for humor in someone who had been doing this as long as she had. "He asked for 30%. "He did," I said. She shook her head once small decisive and walked out into the February night. I sat at the kitchen table after she left and looked at Dominic's message still visible on my phone screen. Then I typed a reply. 4 words, which was more than he deserved and less than he expected. Too late for that. I sent it, put the phone in my pocket, and went to find Frank. There was work to do. Frank Dolan had replaced security teams before. Not often. It was the kind of operation that required precision in the setup and absolute stillness in the execution. Any irregularity in the transition, any guard who asked the wrong question or checked a credential too carefully, and the whole thing unraveled before it began. But Frank had done it twice in his career, in circumstances that could not be discussed, and both times it had worked, because he understood something that most people overlooked. The easiest person to replace is the one whose presence has become invisible through routine. Hargrove Med Group's security contractor ran 12-hour shifts. The day team came on at 6 in the morning, signed in at the lobby desk, and took their positions without variation. They wore the same uniforms, carried the same equipment, and had been doing the same rotation for long enough that the administrative staff barely registered them as individuals anymore. At 5:15 on Thursday morning, Frank met the 12 incoming members of the day team in the parking structure of a grocery store 4 blocks from the Hargrove campus. He showed each of them a badge and a federal court order, authorizing the substitution under the operational security provisions of an active criminal investigation. 11 of the 12 signed the cooperation agreement without comment. The 12th asked 2 careful questions, received 2 careful answers, and signed. By 6:05, Frank's people were in position. Rex had been inside the building since midnight, not in person, but through the building management system, which had a maintenance access port that had not been updated since 2019, and which Rex had been inside for the past 6 hours, installing audio capture equipment at 9 positions throughout the conference floor. By the time the first legitimate Hargrove employee arrived at 7:30, every square foot of the conference center's primary meeting room was covered. I drove past the building at 7:45, not stopping, just taking one pass to read the exterior. The guards at the main entrance were Frank's people. The 2 at the parking structure were Frank's people. The one visible through the lobby glass at the reception desk was Frank's people. From the outside, it looked exactly like a Thursday morning at Hargrove Med Group. I called Claire from the parking lot of a diner 3 blocks away. "They called," she said, picking up immediately. Her voice was taut as a wire drawn too tight, vibrating slightly at the edges. "This morning early, Nora called. She said the family wanted to resolve the situation privately, that there were documents that needed to be signed to formalize the research partnership before the announcement went public." A short, humorless breath. "She said if I came in tomorrow morning and signed, the family would issue a correction to yesterday's press conference, a full retraction." "What did you say?" "I said I would come." A pause. "Dad, am I going to be all right in there?" "Yes," I said. "Absolutely yes. You will be there, I will be in the room." Another pause, longer this time, and in it I could hear Claire doing what I had watched her do since she was a child, taking something frightening and turning it over in her hands until she understood its shape well enough to stop being afraid of it and start being prepared for it instead. "Okay," she said. Her voice had steadied. "What should I wear?" "The green blazer," I said. "The one your mother gave you." A silence that carried its own weight. Then, "Okay, Dad." I ended the call and sat in the diner parking lot for a moment, watching a delivery truck back up to the service entrance across the street. The February sky was flat and white, and without depth, the kind of sky that gave nothing away. My phone buzzed. Rex Judge Whitfield signed the arrest warrants at 8:14. "Torres has them. We are go." I was reading the message when a second one came in, from a number I recognized as Diane's backup line, the one she used when she had found something she did not want to send from her primary. "Walter, something you need to see." Hargrove pulled security footage from Millbrook General Camera coverage from the hallway outside Claire's room, days 1 and 2. He has been reviewing it. I intercepted a communication from his private email to his attorney 20 minutes ago. He is asking about a name. I felt the message before I finished reading it. The name is Warden. I sat very still in the front seat of my truck. Harlan Hargrove had spent 20 years building a file on the operational designation that had come closest to destroying him in 2005. He had updated it periodically. Diane had found that in his internal records. He knew the signature, the way Warden's operations were structured, the way positions were arranged, the way exits were always controlled before entrances. He had studied it the way you studied a threat you had survived once and did not intend to face again unprepared. And now he had seen it. Not in a field operation, not in a federal building, in the security footage of a hospital hallway in Millbrook, Virginia, in the way a 60-year-old man in a plain jacket had positioned himself outside his daughter's room, and without appearing to do anything deliberate at all, controlled every approach to that corridor without being observed doing it. I thought about what that felt like. To look at a camera feed and see a ghost you had been watching for 20 years materialize in the hallway of a hospital in your own city. To understand in the space of however many seconds it took to recognize the pattern that the man you had dismissed as a retired nobody, the father of the researcher, the inconvenient relative, was not what you had assessed him to be. I thought about what Harlan Hargrove was feeling right now at this moment, in his office on the fourth floor of the building 3 blocks away. And then I thought about the fact that it was too late for that feeling to change anything. He could call his attorney, he could try to file motions, freeze assets, trigger contingencies, but his security team was Frank's people, and his conference room was Rex's equipment, and his arrest warrant was sitting in Torres's jacket pocket, with Judge Whitfield's signature at the bottom of it. The 30 hours were almost up. I drove home, showered, and put on the plainest clothes I owned, the gray trousers and the dark blue shirt I had bought at a department store in Millbrook 2 years ago, and worn exactly twice. The clothes of a man no one would look at twice. Claire called at 8 that evening. "Dad," she said, "I am ready." "I know you are," I said. "Is there anything I should know before tomorrow?" I thought about the green blazer, about Ruth who had bought it at a shop in Georgetown on a Saturday afternoon, while Claire was in her second year of graduate school, who had mailed it to her with a note that said simply, "For the days when you need to remember, you are exactly where you are supposed to be." "Wear the blazer," I said. "And remember that everything that happens tomorrow has already been decided by every choice they made before they walked into that room." A long breath on her end of the line, then, "Okay, Dad, good night." "Good night, Claire." I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark after the call ended, with my hands on my knees and the quiet of the house around me, and I thought about Ruth, who would have known exactly what to say about all of this, and who was not here to say it, and whose absence still had the power, 12 years later, to press against the inside of my chest, like something that had not finished finding its shape. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow it ends. Before I take you inside that conference room, the room where Harlan Hargrove believed he had already won comment justice below. So I know you are still watching, because in the next few minutes, every single piece of this falls into place, and I promise you, it was worth the wait. One thing to keep in mind: some moments in this story include fictional details added for storytelling purposes. If you would prefer something different, this is a natural place to step away, and I completely respect that choice. The conference room on the fourth floor of Hargrove Med Group had been designed to make people feel the distance between themselves and power. The ceiling was 12 feet high. The table was 18 feet long, solid walnut, dark enough to absorb the light from the windows rather than reflect it. The chairs along the sides were leather and straight-backed, the kind that offered no comfort and were not intended to. At the far end, the Hargrove family's 3 chairs were slightly larger than the rest. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but enough that anyone sitting across from them would register the difference in their body before their mind caught up. I had sat in rooms like this before. Different cities, different tables, different people at the far end who believed that architecture could substitute for authority. I took the last chair on the left side, closest to the door against the wall, the chair a building manager might use. The chair of someone who was there to observe and hold coats and had nothing to contribute to anything being decided at the table. Nobody looked at me twice. The investors and board members filed in at 9:55, 7 of them, in suits that had been pressed that morning, carrying the particular energy of people who expected to witness a formality and be home by noon. They took seats along the right side of the table, exchanged brief words with one another, and arranged their folders and phones in front of them with the habitual precision of people accustomed to meetings that ran on schedule. Claire came in at 10 o'clock exactly. She was wearing the green blazer. Ruth had bought it in Georgetown on a Saturday afternoon 12 years ago from a shop on Wisconsin Avenue that sold things made to last rather than things made to impress. And the color was the particular green of early spring leaves, not bright, not aggressive, but alive, in a way that the dark room around it was not. Claire walked to the chair they had designated for her, midway down the left side, facing the windows, and sat down with her spine straight and her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her face carrying an expression of composed attention that cost her something to maintain, and that she maintained anyway. Her eyes found mine for one fraction of a second as she sat down. I gave her the smallest nod I could produce. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, something that contained a smile the way a closed hand contains something it is not ready to open yet. Harlan Hargrove entered last. He was 62 years old, and he moved like a man who had never in the full course of his adult life walked into a room that did not belong to him. His suit was charcoal gray and perfectly fitted. His silver hair was combed back from a face that had the particular quality of composed authority that comes from decades of being the most consequential person in any given space. He did not look at the investors when he entered. He did not look at Nora, who was already standing at the end of the table, or at Sylvia, who had arranged herself in the center chair with the posture of a woman who had been photographed in elegant settings for 30 years. He looked at Claire, and then for exactly 3 seconds, he looked at me. I held his gaze without expression. His eyes moved through me, the way eyes move through furniture, registering presence, assigning category, moving on. He had assessed me in the hospital as a retired nobody. Nothing about my gray trousers and my department store shirt suggested he should revise that assessment. He took his seat. Nora opened. She was good at this, precise and unhurried, her voice carrying the tone of someone describing a business arrangement rather than delivering a threat dressed as one. She outlined the transfer agreement in clinical language, the research conducted under the auspices of a collaborative framework, the institutional support provided by Hargrove Med Group, the appropriate formalization of the contribution structure. She pushed a folder toward Claire. Inside it, 4 pages. 4 signatures required. Sylvia watched Claire from the center chair with an expression of practiced maternal concern that would have read as genuine to anyone who had not heard her voice on a 4-minute recording from a locked room. Dominic sat to his father's left and did not look at Claire at all, which told me everything I needed to know about the state of his nerve. Harlan had not spoken yet. When Nora finished, the room held a brief silence, the kind that conferences rooms produce when everyone is waiting for the person at the head of the table to confirm that the performance has been adequate. Then Dominic leaned toward Claire. He kept his voice low, intimate, almost the voice he had used for 3 years, to make her believe she was the most important person in any room he entered. "Sign it," he said. "No one is going to believe a damaged researcher against a family that has saved millions of lives. This ends today one way or another. Sign it and walk away with something." Claire looked at him. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes were very clear and very steady, and in them I could see the woman who had refused to give them a single word in a locked room while exhausted and frightened and alone, and I felt something rise in my chest that had no clean name, not pride, exactly something larger than pride, something that pressed against the inside of my ribs until I had to breathe carefully to keep it contained. She turned away from Dominic and looked down the length of the table, at me. I was already standing. I did it slowly, not dramatically, not the way it would have looked in a film, but with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had decided to stand and was standing, and the quality of that movement was enough to pull every eye in the room toward the end of the table, where the building manager's chair had been occupied by someone who apparently had something to say. Harlan Hargrove looked at me, and this time, something shifted behind his eyes. Not recognition, not yet. But the first edge of it, the beginning of a recalibration, the moment when an assessment that has been held as settled begins almost imperceptibly to move. "You said something accurate just now, Dominic," I said. My voice was even and conversational, the way it had been in 30 years of rooms where the temperature of my voice had mattered. "This is not one person's word against your family." I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. I sent one message, one word, now. Behind Harlan Hargrove, the large display screen on the wall flickered once and changed. The screen behind Harlan Hargrove had been displaying the Hargrove Med Group logo, a clean blue circle with a stylized caduceus at its center, the symbol of a company that had spent 30 years presenting itself as a guardian of health. Then it changed. The first thing that appeared was Audio Claire's voice from the smartwatch recording, filling the conference room through the ceiling speakers that Rex had patched into the building's presentation system the night before. Her voice was rough and exhausted and absolutely unbroken. "I will never give you what you want. Never." And then after a pause, Sylvia Hargrove's voice smooth and cold and unmistakable. "She hasn't suffered enough. Increase the pressure." The sound of Sylvia's own voice in that room, coming from those speakers in front of 7 investors and 4 board members who had spent years attending her foundation. Galas and accepting her awards, the effect was physical. 2 of the investors pushed back from the table. One of the board members pressed both hands flat on the walnut surface as if he needed to confirm it was still solid. Sylvia herself went very still. The color left her face in a single visible wave. The screen shifted. Security footage from the Ridley Creek Bridge access road, a black Escalade. A woman stepping out, standing at the guardrail for 57 seconds, looking down at something below the frame, getting back in, driving away. 40 seconds of footage. The timestamp in the corner read the morning Claire had been found. A board member said quietly and with great precision, Is that nobody answered him? Nobody needed to. The financial records came next, columns of transactions, routing numbers, the $40,000 moving through 3 accounts to Detective Morrow's credit union in Harrisonburg. Then the shell company structure. Then the payments to security contractors with federal records. Then Dr. Reeves's documentation of the falsified FDA submission, with the adverse event rates side by side, 1.8%, reported 14% actual. Harlan Hargrove turned to his security team. "Remove them," he said, his voice carrying the absolute command of a man who had given orders for 40 years and never once had them refused. "Remove all of them, now." The guard nearest the door reached up and removed his earpiece. He turned toward Harlan with the steady, impersonal expression of a federal agent who has been waiting for exactly this moment for 36 hours. "Mr. Hargrove, your security detail has been replaced as of 6 o'clock this morning." The door opened. Agent Rebecca Torres walked in, first followed by 6 federal agents in tactical vests, 2 FDA criminal investigators, and 3 agents from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They came in quickly and without theater, the way professionals enter a room when the work has already been done, and what remains is simply the closing of a door. Dominic stood up so fast, his chair fell backward and hit the floor. Frank Dolan stepped out from the corner, where he had been standing since 7 that morning, and he put one hand on Dominic's shoulder and pressed him back down with a force that was not violent but was not negotiable. Dominic's legs buckled under the pressure, and he dropped into the chair and sat there with his hands shaking visibly against his thighs. Nora did not move. She sat with her hands folded on the table and her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, already somewhere else, entirely already calculating. Sylvia looked at the screen, at the footage of herself at the bridge, at the 57 seconds of herself standing at a guardrail, looking down at her son's fiancé lying injured below, while the February dawn came up gray and cold around her. Her composure, which had held through 30 years of cameras and ceremonies and the specific performance of being Sylvia Hargrove, came apart. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone who has never learned to control themselves, but in the way of something structural giving way, the kind of collapse that happens when the load becomes greater than the material was designed to bear. Her shoulders dropped a full inch, her chin dropped. Her hands folded perfectly on the table in front of her began to shake. Torres crossed the room and stopped in front of Harlan. "Harlan Hargrove," she said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, wire fraud, theft of trade secrets, healthcare fraud, obstruction of justice, bribery of a federal official, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." Harlan looked at Torres. Then he looked past her to the end of the room, to the man in the gray trousers and the department store shirt, who was standing very still beside the last chair on the left. He looked at me for a long time. Something moved through his face, not fear exactly, but the specific devastating recognition of a man who has held a wrong belief for 20 years, and is understanding in the space of a single moment exactly how wrong it was. His jaw worked. His eyes, which had carried nothing but cold authority since he walked into the room, showed something else now, something exposed and raw that he had never intended anyone to see. "You," he said. His voice came out quieter than anything he had said all morning, almost without breath. "You are Warden." I looked at him across the length of the room. Then I turned and I walked to Claire, and I put my arms around my daughter, and I held on. Her arms came around my back, and she pressed her face against my shoulder, and the sound she made was not a cry. Exactly, it was something older than crying, something that had been compressed for 6 days, and was finally in this room, with handcuffs clicking behind us, and Torres reading rights in her steady federal voice allowed to come out. I held her, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. It was over. Justice does not arrive the way people expect it to. It does not come with the sudden, clean finality of a door slamming shut. It comes in increments in paperwork and hearings and continuances and depositions that run 4 hours and produce 3 usable minutes of testimony in the slow accumulation of procedure that the law requires, because the law understands better than most people do that speed and accuracy are not the same thing. The federal grand jury returned indictments on a Tuesday morning in late March. The arraignment was the following Thursday. Harlan and Sylvia entered not guilty pleas through their attorneys, which surprised no one, and the pretrial detention motion was granted based on flight risk and the depth of their financial resources outside the United States. They went directly from the courtroom to a federal detention facility in Alexandria, and I watched them walk out of the room between federal marshals and felt something that was not satisfaction. Something quieter than that. Something that had more in common with the particular exhaustion of a long job, finally finished, than with anything that resembled celebration. Dominic pleaded guilty in April, as part of an agreement that reduced his exposure on the kidnapping charge in exchange for full cooperation with the prosecution. His attorney had negotiated hard for immunity and received nothing close to it. 12 years federal sentencing guidelines, no parole consideration before the 8-year mark. The cooperation had helped him avoid a life sentence. It had not helped him avoid what he had earned. Nora received 3 years in federal prison and 3 years of supervised release, plus a financial penalty that effectively ended her legal career. She did not speak during sentencing. She sat with the same fixed calculating expression she had worn in the conference room, already somewhere else, already working an angle that probably did not exist. Detective Ray Morrow was sentenced separately in a state proceeding that ran concurrent with the federal case. 8 years for bribery and obstruction. His attorney argued mitigating circumstances. Judge Patricia Henley, who had been on the state bench for 19 years and had heard every mitigating argument that had ever been constructed, was not moved. Thomas Brierly, the warehouse manager who had recanted his testimony 20 years earlier and allowed Harlan Hargrove to walk free, was located in Charlottesville, Virginia, and indicted separately on charges of obstruction of justice and perjury. The statute of limitations had expired on the original case, but the federal prosecutor's office found enough in Diane's financial records to build a new charge. He did not fight it. The official sentencing came on a Thursday morning in May. Judge Carol Whitfield looked at Harlan Hargrove across the federal courtroom and delivered 22 years without early release consideration, followed by Sylvia's 18 in the measured, unhurried cadence of a woman who understood that the words she was speaking would outlast the sound of them in the room. When the gavel came down the second time, Claire's hand found mine under the edge of the gallery railing and held on so tightly that I felt the pressure of each individual finger. I held back just as hard. It was 3 weeks before sentencing that we had the conversation. Claire came to the house on Dunmore Street on a Sunday evening, which she had started doing again, stopping by after her shift at the research lab, staying for dinner, leaving around 9, the way she used to. Before 3 years of Dominic's orbit had gradually reduced the frequency of those visits without either of us quite acknowledging it was happening. She was standing at the kitchen counter making tea when she said, without looking up from the kettle, "Dad, who is Warden?" I set my fork down. She turned around and leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, and her chin slightly raised, the posture she had used since she was 14, when she wanted to make clear that she was asking a question she intended to have answered. So, I told her. I told her about the unit, the designation, the structure, the work that had no official name in any public document. I told her about the 20 years and the cases and the parts of those years that I was permitted to describe and the parts I was not. I told her about her mother and the night that changed everything and why I had chosen the life I chose in Millbrook over the life I had lived before it. I told her about the 12 years of quiet and what they had cost and what they had protected and whether I believed the trade had been worth making. She listened without interrupting. Her tea went cold on the counter behind her. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet, and she stood there for a long moment, with her arms still crossed and her eyes moving through something internal that I could not follow. Then her arms came uncrossed and dropped to her sides, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not quite grief, not quite relief, but something between them that seemed to be making room for both. "I used to think you were just quiet," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. "I thought that was just who you were, a quiet man who fixed clocks and went fishing and didn't need much." She pressed her lips together hard for a second before she continued. "I spent years wondering why I always felt like there was a room in you I had never been shown. The ache that moved through my chest at that was the specific ache of something true. I am sorry," I said. "I thought I was protecting you. I think I was also protecting myself from the conversation we are having right now." Claire looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. She was doing what she always did, holding the shape of something until she understood it well enough to carry it. "I wish you had told me sooner," she said. "So do I said. 2 words, the truest I had spoken in 12 years. She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from me at the table, the same table where Frank had sat, where Diane had spread her documents, where I had read through a file from 20 years ago in lamplight and decided it was time to stop being quiet. "What do we do now?" she asked. I thought about the question. Outside, the May evening was settling over Millbrook, the sky going the deep blue of late spring, the kind of evening that makes the world seem temporarily larger than its problems. "You have a treatment to bring to the people who need it," I said, "and I have a few old friends who might be useful." The small smile that crossed her face was so much like Ruth that my breath caught in my throat for a moment, not with grief, but with something that held grief and gratitude together in the same space, the way the best things in life tend to do. Outside on the sidewalk, Marcus Webb was helping his mother Helen into a car after her second infusion appointment. Helen looked up and caught my eye through the window and raised one hand in a small wave. Her color was better than it had been in the photograph Marcus had shown me in his apartment on Clement Street. Some things were already beginning. Summer came to Millbrook the way summer always does in Virginia, not gradually, but all at once, as if the season had been waiting just beyond the tree line and decided on a particular morning in early July to stop waiting. The sunflowers Claire had planted along the entrance path to the Claire Hale Research Foundation had come up taller than anyone expected. They stood in 2 rows on either side of the front walkway, yellow and broad-faced, and turning slowly toward the light, and when I pulled into the parking lot at 8:15 on the morning of the opening, the first thing I saw was those flowers, and the second thing I saw was Earl Simmons standing in front of them in a jacket and tie, looking at them with the expression of a man who has unexpectedly found himself somewhere that matters. I parked and walked over. "You look uncomfortable," I said. Earl pulled at his collar with one finger. "I own one tie," he said. "I have had it since my daughter's wedding in 2009, and it still does not match this jacket, which Danny pointed out approximately 11 times on the drive over." He looked down at the tie, then back at the sunflowers. "She planted these herself." "Every one," I said. Earl nodded slowly. His jaw tightened for just a moment, the jaw of a man who was feeling something he did not have language for, and was not going to manufacture language for it when the moment did the job better. Danny appeared from behind Earl's pickup truck, 17 years old, and a full inch taller than he had been in February. He extended his hand with a formality that made me want to smile, and that I respected too much to smile at. "Mr. Hale," he said. "And good to see you, Danny," I said. Inside the foundation's main hall was not large. Claire had been deliberate about that. The walls were pale gray. The floors were the same hardwood that had been in the building when Claire leased it, refinished rather than replaced. Along the far wall was the patient wall, gray stone, smooth and matte, with names carved into it at eye level. The first 43 patients enrolled in the Foundation's Access program. Below the names, a single line: "Because medicine is for people, not profit." Helen Webb was standing in front of it when I came in. She was not in a wheelchair today. She stood with a cane, her color better than it had been at the sentencing, her eyes moving across the names with the expression of someone reading their own name in a list and understanding the full weight of what it means to be counted among the living. Marcus stood beside her, his hand light on her back. He looked at me over his mother's shoulder. His eyes were red at the rims. I gave him a nod. He pressed his lips together and nodded back. Frank, Diane, and Rex were in the corner near the window, 3 people who had spent careers in rooms that could not be described, now standing in a room that could. Frank raised his coffee cup half an inch when he saw me. That was Frank's version of a standing ovation. Claire found me 20 minutes later. She took my arm and walked me toward the patient wall. We stood in front of it. I read the 43 names, people I would never meet, people whose names were here, because Claire had spent 8 years refusing to believe that what she built belonged to anyone other than those who needed it. "Dad," Claire said, "look at the bottom." I looked. Below the list of names and letters, smaller than the rest, but cut just as deep into the stone, was a line that had not been in the architectural plans. In memory of Ruth Hale, who knew this first. I stood very still. The room continued around me, Earl talking to Danny Rex, laughing at something Diane had said, Helen asking a researcher about her next treatment. All of it present and real, and continuing the way life insists on continuing, even in moments that ask you to stop. I reached out and put my hand against the stone. It was cool under my palm, smooth and permanent, in the way that certain things once made refuse to be unmade. Ruth had been gone for 12 years. She had never seen this room, never heard the name. Hargrove never sat in a federal courtroom watching justice arrive. She had only done what she always did, looked at her daughter, seen what her daughter was capable of, said so clearly, and trusted Claire to do the rest. She had known this first. "Dad," Claire said softly. "Are you all right?" I kept my hand on the stone a moment longer. The July light came through the windows warm and unhurried, falling across the names and across Ruth's name at the bottom. "Yes," I said. I took my hand from the wall and looked at my daughter, at the woman who had held a line in a locked room, left a message on a wall for her father, and built something worth protecting. "Yes," I said again. "I am." Looking back, I understand now that family betrayal does not always arrive loudly. It arrives quietly in a careful smile, a borrowed promise, a ring with a hidden tracker inside. I was not a perfect father. I kept secrets that built walls between me and the daughter I would have died to protect. If this family story leaves you with one thing, let it be this: do not wait for a crisis to tell the people you love the truth. I waited 12 years. Do not make my mistake. I believe, and I have believed this since the night I knelt beside my daughter on a frozen riverbank, that God places the right people in our path exactly when we need them. A retired fisherman, an old team, a daughter who scratched a secret message on a wall because she never stopped trusting her father would come. My personal belief: family betrayal, built on greed, always collapses under the weight of love, built on truth. This family story, rooted in the quiet communities of Virginia, proved that ordinary people standing together are never as powerless as powerful people want them to believe. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that. Drop a comment below, tell me your city, and subscribe so our next story finds you. Thank you for staying until the very end. Some stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and growth. If that is not for you, we understand. Choose what serves you best.